Hello, this is Father David Nix at the Padre Peregrino podcast. I'm very glad tonight to be joined by my old friend Mike. Mike is a retired high-ranking naval official who served nearly 30 years as a highly decorated Navy SEAL officer. He commanded SEAL teams and counter-terrorist task forces in crisis and contingency operations through 13 deployments, including those to Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Southeast Asia. The majority of his career was spent in the military's special operations counter-terrorist community, which includes SEAL Team 6, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and many other organizations whose operations often require presidential decision-making. The missions he was on gave him occasional access and insight into the politics of national security decisions made at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Mike, great to see you again and have you on my podcast.
Father, great to see you again. Thanks for having me on tonight.
Mike, to my listeners, Mike's a few inches shorter than me. And Mike, I never told you about this, but when I was in a parish on the East Coast and I first met you in the pastoral council, I looked over and I thought, this quiet little guy must be a pediatrician or something. And turns out Mike can kill me by just looking at me as a top-ranking Navy SEAL. So I never told you about that. Folks, TCE stands for Theology and Current Events. This is a TCE 15, Navy SEAL speaks on the state of the church. In all honesty, that's to gel with TCE 16, which is going to be Mike speaking about the state of the state. But it's not exactly the state of the church, so don't get too pumped for really controversial stuff. Tonight's going to be a little bit more on virtue. Almost we could say that Mike's going to speak on the state of the domestic church. And then also, just for my listeners, we're going to get back to the VLX and CPX during Easter week. Next week during Holy Week, I have a special Stations of the Cross for you to meditate on. And please subscribe if you're new. Now, Mike is a convert to the Catholic faith. And before we get to his time as a Navy SEAL, Mike, would you tell us about your conversion? And I think your conversion was in the SEALs. So maybe if you could integrate what brought you, maybe tell us a little bit first what brought you into the SEALs, why you wanted to do it, how buds went, and what brought you into the Catholic faith. I know that's a lot to talk about there, but just
sure thing, Father. No, I'm a midlife adult convert. I was in my early 30s, and interestingly enough, I was on sabbatical from the SEAL teams going through graduate school, and so primed to search for truth in many areas, but in particular religious truth. And so my path to conversion was first realizing that Christianity was important, and then I eventually started with authors like C.S. Lewis. And then I fortunately had an old friend who was able to point me in the right direction. Once I began to explore the arguments for the truth of Catholicism, it was like so many people have commented that all the locks came unlocked at once and the door swung open. It was an intellectual approach to religious truth and an intellectual conviction that Catholicism was true. Now, when I went out into the field to sort of explore what it really looked like out there, the only answer was those communities that celebrated the traditional Latin Mass. I found that all other expressions of Catholicism, in particular the Novus Ordo, in the liberal diocese that I lived in, it was no different from Presbyterianism or Methodism or anything or anything like that. So I would say the connection between my career as a Navy SEAL and my conversion is, I don't think it's not as strong as you might imagine. It's not a foxhole type thing.
Sure.
It was, but what is interesting, it happened right before we went to war in 2001. So I think that there is, I think that's an act of grace.
And when you said C.S. Lewis, was the Lord Liar Lunatic thing, kind of those syllogisms, central to some of these conversion decisions?
More the mere Christianity type of arguments that just strengthened my sort of the conviction of my DNA that Christianity is the place to look, and that's at least the field to start in.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah. But I grew up in an Eastern Orthodox sect. It's a religion with a valid priesthood and valid sacraments and long liturgies and that kind of thing. So I knew what real worship from a youth. I knew what real worship looked like. But then when you leave home, you sort of drift away. And I became essentially a worldling or neo-pagan until in my early 30s.
And so you weren't too convicted of orthodoxy, either big O orthodoxy or even small O orthodoxy as a kid, huh?
One thing to no, not at all, because as everyone, well, as many have commented, orthodoxy, it's confusing whether it's the worship of God or the worship of your ethnicity,
Mm.
especially in the diaspora. These various Orthodox churches, whether it's Russian or wherever it might be, it's not clear where you stop, where the ethnicity or the nationalism stops and the devotion to God begins.
What was it like in the SEAL teams as far as religion 30 years ago and now? Like, what did you find? Is it just kind of pure paganism and heathenism, or was there a point where there was lots of Christians and now New Age? Or have you noticed a difference in the average SEAL?
Yeah, I have noticed a difference during my career. It has become more. I've definitely seen more Christians of various confessions.
Mhm.
In the mid '80s, in the mid to late '80s, when I joined the SEAL teams and I became a young SEAL, and there was absolutely no religious connection. It was not immoral so much as amoral.
Mhm.
Um, it just wasn't. There was just
Yep.
nothing there. But it seems like as the decades have progressed, and more people are compelled to choose between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of this world, it has affected SEALs as well.
Like more people are going either far right or far left. That's not the right term, but there are. I mean, who was it? Father Jim Altman was telling me that he met a bunch of good Catholic SEALs down in San Diego. So it sounds like there's some guys finding our Lord and finding the traditional faith in the SEAL teams.
Yeah, I believe that's true. Very much so. I mean, it's gone from a drip to maybe a trickle.
Okay, that's good. I mean, this people say 2020 stands for vision of 2020, and it is true that a lot of fence riding got knocked one way or the other last year, it seems. Now, Mike, you entered kind of through some of these traditional communities into the Catholic faith. There's a lot of people nowadays who are looking at all of these doctrinal scandals and a lot of the priest-child scandals and everything, and there are people who are going to Orthodoxy, or um, some people are even going atheist from traditional Catholicism. Has the effeminacy in the hierarchy and the scandals and the doctrinal confusion that you see, has that ever made you think to leave the church? Or maybe a little less personal question besides, I mean, because like Cardinal Newman said, 1,000 difficulties doesn't equal one doubt. What would your advice be to people out there who are so fed up with the effeminacy in the hierarchy? What would you as a Navy SEAL say to those people at this point? Or maybe a better question is, did that ever shake the wheels in the back of your bus in becoming Catholic? Was this ever embarrassing to go from, the most elite teams to then reading that your new team has made, usually when it makes the news, it's not the best news?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right that there's scandal and there's effeminacy and there's things that are definitely to be regretted out there in the Catholic field. During the first 3 years of my conversion, I would take my family to a Novus Ordo mass in the morning, and then I would go by myself to an SSPX mass in the afternoon, and I did that because those logistics reasons and those kinds of things, and the contrast between the two is just so stark. Fortunately, I mean, God has always allowed me to have access to the traditional mass and sacraments, even if it requires a little bit of work. But my belief in the truth of the Catholic faith and all its doctrines and dogmas began at an intellectual level. And so in almost a deductive fashion, once you realize that this authority is worthy of your obedience and trust, and that they speak the truth, you can make allowances for certain modern local deviations. But then, it opens up a whole other can of worms, Father, because there's a good reason why the Catholic Church looks like this today. I mean, it goes back in prophecy, back through the 19th century. I mean, this just doesn't happen out of nowhere.
What would you say that was? What's the prophecies you think about the most?
Well, I mean, all the way from Lourdes to Fatima to Akita, and just many others, and they all, in fact, going all the way back to Quito, Ecuador, 400 some odd years ago. I mean, it's just remarkable how how prophetic, how accurately prophetic Our Lady's appearances and have been. And so you can explain why it's happening. You can see it unfolding. You can see history, ecclesiological history. I'm sorry, unfolding in real time in front of you, just like it says in almost like a Jack Chick's comic book that you got, and that kind of like. And this is why I'll do a little aside. When I read Jack, Jack Chick's, right?
Jack Chick, the guy, the anti-Catholic guy who writes the books.
Yeah. He writes all these sort of Armageddon sort of stuff. You're like, that's
right.
Absolutely fantastic. That none of that could ever happen. But it's kind of happening,
And I like the fact that you mentioned like Quito and Akita, or Quito, Ecuador, and Akita, because I think there's a lot of normie Catholics who hear us Catholics, or traditional normie Catholics hear us traditional Catholics talk about these, and it sounds really dark and everything, but really it's actually super positive, because if you're like, okay, Our Lady warned us at Quito, La Salette, Fatima, and Akita that things would be a mess. We can't really get mad at God and be like, you never told us. Our Lady in every single apparition was like, at the human level, at the exterior level, things are going to look really bad. And so the fulfillment of that prophecy, I find to be really good news. I mean, you mentioned Quito, Ecuador. Here, Our Lady shows us, she actually names the century 500 years ahead of time that all the sacraments would get tanked. You look at probably the best evidence of Fatima that this was going to be apostasy from the top down. Well, that's pretty bad news, but it really shows how much heaven loves us, that heaven continued to warn us about what we were going to see. So I agree. I think that's all the more reason to stay in the Catholic Church, that we were told there would be this infiltration into the church, but Jack Chick is a super anti-Catholic guy, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
But actually, surprisingly, he had an effect on me when I was in about fifth grade or so.
Oh, what was that?
For some reason, I got a hold of a few of his comic books, and I read them, and I was just fascinated by all the discussions of prophecy and Armageddon and that kind of stuff. And I thought it was the mark of the beast and the 666 business. I thought it was so outlandish. How could this ever come to pass? But really, in a strange sort of twisted sort of way, it is coming to pass.
You don't mean that's the church. You just mean globally.
I mean the development of human events.
That's what exactly.
Yeah.
Right. No, I was at World Youth Day here in Denver in 1993 with Pope John Paul II. And I remember Jack Chick tracts were getting handed out everywhere. They may have even been dropping them out of airplanes on us, because they knew there was going to be like 100,000 Catholic kids. So that was my first experience with the Jack Chick tracts, was World Youth Day. I think I was 14 years old, 1993, here in Denver. But Mike, so there's a reaction against this effeminacy that sometimes seems in the Catholic world to be this macho approach to masculinity. There was a guy here in Denver, actually he was a Marine who taught up in Fort Collins. I think he's out in Atlanta now, but he wrote a really interesting article called Wimps and Barbarians. And basically his thing was, men these days are going to one of the two opposites, either being a wimp or a barbarian. And I think the happy medium is being a gentleman. And that doesn't mean, when people talk about, St. Thomas Aquinas is often misquoted, the virtues and the mean. Well, that doesn't mean the bell curve mean between two vices. It's more the mountain between two valleys. And so when we talk about a gentleman being between being a wimp and barbarian, that doesn't mean a gentleman's a half wimp and a half barbarian. It means the gentleman is avoiding being both a barbarian and a wimp. So this is kind of a rambling question, and tell me if it's a hard one to answer, but what do you think needs to happen in male formation and raising good men, so they doesn't go like just jumping over a fire naked out in the forest like some of these men's Catholic retreats do, but also isn't just sitting around sharing your feelings? Do you have any suggestions? Not the best question there, but.
No, I agree with you in one sense, in that both the wimp and the barbarian sort of template are both the same. They're just different aspects of the same error. And the error is, and it may have been C.S. Lewis who called our era the era of hollow-chested men.
Yes.
And they're both sort of compensations against men who are either who completely lack confidence and so resort to passivity, or who lack confidence and so compensate by being overly, demonstrative in terms of machoism. Right? They're both products, not so much of a defective religious culture, but you could make that argument. But I think much more just sort of the cultural toxin that we swim in, which is which is luxury and security, and men are not allowed to be men because there's no challenges for them. I can remember growing up in my sort of working class home, being an avid reader and reading about heroes and generals and statesmen and this and all these great things. And I looked around at my life and how the men around me lived, and they weren't immoral by any means, but there was what did they do? You know, there was no echo of that in the culture that I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and it's even true today. I mean, your average man, what does he do to actually build confidence himself as a man? You know, he goes to college maybe and points and clicks for a while and moves information. Not a bad thing, but you can see where it's deficient in some respects. Or he perhaps goes over to hedonism in a sort of materialistic or to gratify his senses, and so but then he lacks the experience about making decisions and judgment and that kind of thing. So we just don't build as a culture. We just don't give men the opportunity to build themselves.
And what would you suggest for young men who are Catholic to grow in virtue, to get out of that comfort zone? There's things like Exodus 90, which I'm actually really impressed with. We don't see a lot of people in the traditional Catholic world doing it, but I'm very much a fan of the Exodus 90 precisely because it's cold showers and it's fasting and it's, so I think that's one possible answer. Can you think of anything else in the formation of men that needs to happen, especially in families? What should fathers be teaching their sons to get them out of this comfort zone? Because you're right. I mean, I call them the 3 H's: health, hygiene, and heat. Health, hygiene, and heat. You and I have the opportunity. I don't know what you do. You probably go run around in the snow as a SEAL all the time, but your average person has more health, hygiene, and heat than a 19th century king, than an 18th century king, than a 17th century king. We have even someone middle class, even lower class in this country has more health, hygiene, and heat than any king or queen before the 19th century. And that's not our fault, but we have to push against it somehow, right?
Yeah. So your initial question, you're absolutely right. And one of the misconceptions is that you can somehow harden yourself and train yourself to kind of transcend these luxuries like health and hygiene. And because when you go out there around the snow, for example, as you put it, ultimately you can say stop. You're in control. It doesn't get hard until you're not in control anymore. Yeah. And so I would say, I'd rephrase the question. Instead of what would you tell young men, I would say, what would I tell mothers out there who are the mothers of young men? Because that is, I think, that the kind of the decisive point in that, parents, mothers, especially, because mothers are especially in the young formative years. I mean, there's just so much sheltering going on. It's funny, example, who hasn't been to the 4-year-old t-ball game at the local YMCA or the soccer game, and after like 8 minutes of exertion, everybody stopped, come in and get snacks and juice boxes and Cheetos and stuff, all that stuff. I mean, it's just symptomatic of it's just ridiculous. Yeah. I mean, if think about the legends of the Spartan moms, come home with your shield or on it. Now it's a little bit over the top, but we need a lot more of that than we do juice boxes and Cheetos.
Yeah, you think of the Maccabee mom, right? I mean, she wouldn't let her kids even have the slightest appearance of eating pork, the slightest appearance of not being kosher. She was encouraging them to go die on this enormous frying pan, which they did. That's a great example. So what drew you to the SEAL teams as a young man in high school? Was it something of being out of control of your life in that?
No, I didn't even hear. Yeah, I didn't even hear the SEAL teams when I was in high school. It wasn't, in fact, till my undergraduate experience. I knew I wanted to be a naval officer, and because my grandfather was a Navy vet, and he just sort of pushed me in that direction. But when I explored being a fighter pilot and being a Marine Corps officer, which is a naval officer. and some other things. And but I cannot explain what turned me towards the SEALs, other than a desire for real, authentic experience, and not managing a platform of switches, or kind of being stood off a little bit from the real experience of war, which is just so much of what the modern, what a war fighting experience is today. That's all I can really explain. Just a sense, a gut sense that was the most authentic way to get the experience of combat and war. And interestingly, when I joined the SEAL teams, they were marginal. They were completely marginal. I had a very senior officer tell me at the time, you're throwing away your career right now by picking the SEALs.
Really?
Because they were not important. They never got promoted. Vietnam was in the past.
Oh, gotcha. So frogmen was only a term everybody loved in the past, 10, 15, 20 years?
Frogman is an older term, and it probably goes back to the sort of the amphibious. Right? That's right. The amphibious origin of UDT teams and the frogmen.
I should just call this podcast Frogman 1 and Frogman 2.
It's surprising how much SEALs are not in the water these days.
Now, Mike, you mentioned confidence, and you probably would laugh if I described SEALs as humble, because you've probably seen a lot more arrogance than just what I've seen on like podcasts and stuff. And I know you avoid a lot of the celebrity SEAL culture. I think you didn't even know who Jocko Willink was, and I watched. But when he had on a Johnny Kim, I was pretty impressed with their humility in the sense. And people often say if you walk into a bar, maybe a low-ranking Army guy will want to fight you or something, but the SEAL already knows he can just destroy you, so he has nothing to prove. And so there is a reputation of SEALs having a certain level of humility. Maybe it's not humility, maybe it's a meekness, but I just want to see if you could maybe connect these three virtues: trust or confidence in God, self-confidence, but a healthy level, not like the new age self-confidence, but just a healthy level of self-confidence, and then humility. I don't know. Personally, I'm impressed with how SEALs combine self-confidence and humility. And then the Christian ones can combine confidence in God and humility. But maybe at the general level, how should people combine those two in their life? Because at the very cursory or superficial level, it seems like those two virtues are contrary to each other, right?
But the Christian virtue of humility and this idea of humbleness, humility on a natural level are directly related. And I'll give you an analogy: is a Catholic will be or should be humble because he has fallen, and he's fallen many, many, many times, and he knows how easily it is for him to fall again. Knows he probably will. And so in the same way, here's the analogy with those who are in not only the SEALs but who do extreme things: is they run up against the edge where I see where it's bad enough that I could quit and give up, where I could roll over and get into a fetal position. I've been close to that. I know what the fear of death looks like because I've been close to that in some cases. And so you have a real sense for your human limitations. Even the idea of a bar fight, for example, and because you started to use that, and that's interesting. People who've been in real fights know that there's never a winner. Both sides are getting bloody, and you may be the guy who's slashed, across the throat. It doesn't work like it does in the movie where one guy takes on 10, beats 10, 12 people. It doesn't work. Everyone gets bloody and beat up. And so I guess when you have that real authentic experience that's how it works, you tend to be pretty humble about your position, and you realize, I'm not a superhero. I need to exercise good judgment here in order to stay alive.
Yeah, that's maybe why I thought you were a pediatrician when I first met you at the pastoral council, because you didn't come out and be like, "Yeah, I'm Mike, SEAL Team 6 or whatever." It was, that's a good segue into another question I wanted to ask you. Is it seems like we describe the traditional world right now as a circular firing line because everyone has their pet project and everyone's attacking each other. You've spent some time in SSPX and FSSP. I've gone all the way from the charismatic movement to doing Latin Mass exclusively now. And, but this line that the trad world is like this circular firing line. and people disagree. It'd be easy for me to sit here and say we all disagree on unimportant issues. That's not really true. I mean, there's a divide right down the middle. Which traditionalists even believe who is Pope right now? So these are important issues. I don't mean to sideline these as unimportant issues, but one of the hazards of this living as every man for himself in the traditional world is that we're no longer team players. And I think one of the amazing things about the SEAL teams is their goal isn't to get them home, it's to get your brother home. It's to have the whole team win. And this is a lot deeper than they're like, there's no I in team or whatever. I mean, the real philosophy of that is essentially at its very heart that you guys are the SEAL teams, not a SEAL. How can the traditional world kind of start to look to take care of each other? I don't even know the right question. Again, I'm giving you bad questions, but hopefully you can get the gist of what I'm laying down.
I do understand what you're asking. The, first off, so it is an undeniable aspect of the traditionalism that there's a certain bitterness, defensiveness, curmudgeonliness. I mean, everybody's noticed it. My wife has commented on it. She notices it. It can be off-putting. It may come from a number of places, but one of the places it comes from, I believe, is just there's a certain spiritual pride that goes with being a traditional Catholic. Like somehow I've figured it out and I've got it, and all these other people who are trying, but may go to a different kind of mass. Somehow they're less than. So there's a spiritual pride aspect of it. But on a more practical, that's what I think produces the circular firing squad. Mm-hmm. On a more practical level, let's just talk about the building of trust. Traditional parishes tend to be not geographic, right? They tend to be built around the personality of the priest or the society or fraternity that's giving the priest. And so you have people from all over, and they just don't have any contact with each other than a few minutes a week after Mass. And so the number one ingredient to build trust is contact, repeated contact, proximity, doing things together, doing hard things together to build up that level of trust. You can't do it based on an abstract idea that we've got the right faith here, which also produces spiritual pride, and then leave all the middle stuff out and then hope to get along well at the tactical level. It's just rife. It's a situation rife for misunderstanding, disagreement. So what do traditional Catholics need to do? I guess I would just start with that idea that trust, trust takes time to build, and it has to build on much more than simply a co-parishioner spiritual level.
That's brilliant. Yeah. I think that's brilliant because you're right. People drive 2 to 3 hours and then you're exhausted after a 2-hour drive. I guess families have to be intentional with families. Hey, can you come over and maybe put a little moratorium on super, super complex, controversial topics? And anyone who listens to my podcast knows that's the last thing I'm going to do is put a moratorium on controversial topics. But really, maybe there is a time just to say, hey, let's not debate if there should be a second confiteor or who the Pope is. Let's just get together and have a cookout or a barbecue and late at night, 11 p.m. when we're doing whiskey and cigars, we can debate the intense stuff, but let's just get the kids together. So I think that's a great point. People need to be intentional because families, we're entering a time, and we're going to talk about this in part 2 with Mike on the state. I think we're entering a time in the country when families are really going to need families as things fall apart. At least that's my belief. Things are going to fall apart. We'll see what Mike has to say about that. But I think him and I both agree trad families are going to need trad families. Even Novus Ordo families are going to need Novus Ordo families. As we're looking at some major changes in our country and church right now. What's the number one virtue missing among young Catholic men today? Not just the traditional world, but what are young boys and men, if you could inject one virtue into their life right now, what would it be?
I don't know if it's the number one virtue, but the virtue that I see missing is fortitude. It's courage. It's a failure to it's just a failure to stand up with what the intellect perceives as a Catholic truth, and a willing to stand up for that in public or even semi-private sort of gatherings or relationships. And a classic example is people who are embarrassed to say grace in a restaurant, or people in a corporate environment who won't challenge the woke narrative, for example, and they'll just sort of remain silent. Sometimes there are good reasons for doing that. Other times they don't do it. They don't do it because they just don't want to put themselves out there. I see it as a lack of fortitude, but going back to that idea of humility, I think we all lack fortitude at some level. It's just, I would never want to say that anyone's sort of bomb-proof in this regard.
That's great. Yeah. Well, and I think you guys probably learn a lot of humility in Bud. I know there's a lot of people who think Buds is the end all be all of SEALs, and it's not. That's just the weed out part. But you probably get pushed, as you said, into that fetal position. You have to learn how to trust your brothers in all of that. Alice von Hildebrand, she had an interesting virtue. She said the number one virtue missing among men and women these days, she said reverence. I thought that was a really interesting one. And she meant reverence before God and even reverence, among each other. She meant that people don't even have reverence for each other, for old people, for the person of the opposite gender. And one reason we're going to talk in part 2 about, is the military really where young men want to end up with where our country's going? We'll talk about that in part 2. But one reason as a whole why I like the military is the ranking system and the manners system is such that you can learn reverence. And it's almost the very last place in the United States, it seems to me, that there is any striation of still holding to rules on manners, how you talk to people, looking people in the eyes, shaking their hands. Anything to add to that?
No, other than you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, that I don't want to spill over too much to what we might talk about in the next hour about the state of the U.S. military, but that is a very clear and solid, positive characteristic of the military environment. And Alice von Hildebrand and her generation, I would never want to gainsay anything that they say, because the amount of wisdom there is edifying. It really is.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Father Ripperger says that there's a real problem in the trad movement of lack of humility that he believes leads to a lack of charity and even a lot of falls in chastity. Now, he gave that talk 10 or 15 years ago. I have to admit that I've been very, very edified at what I believe has been a huge increase in charity and humility in the trad movement the past 5 years. I guess I've been in it 5 years, so maybe I should say the past 2 years I've been meeting very, very humble and even evangelical trads who want to get out, hand out miraculous medals, serve the poor. So I really do believe the future of the traditional movement is more evangelical, more chaste, more humble, more zealous. Did I say charitable? More charitable. That's the most important. So again, Father Ripperger's talk was, I think, 10 or 15 years ago. He basically said trads have so many falls in chastity because they have no humility. But I think we've taken so many hits the past few years as far as just confusion and being sidelined in diocese, and like you said, people's own personal falls has led to a lot of people to give their lives entirely to Christ and say, I have to start from the grassroots level here. I can't just say I'm saved because I'm going to the Latin Mass. We have a spiritual battle, every one of us, no matter what Mass you go to, and humility is going to be the foundation for all of that.
For my part, Father, I've been most impressed in the last year or so as I moved to a different part of the country, so I have an increased contact with the Novus Ordo Mass and those that attend it regularly. And frankly, I'm pretty encouraged by the level of commitment and piety, really commitment to Catholic traditionalism, small t, that I see there. It's just a grace that God will, it's how God will save his church.
And there's a lot of people who weren't too interested in the Latin Mass, but once they found they couldn't actually go to Novus Ordo, they found their way to the FSSP or SSPX under COVID. These lockdowns, there's a lot, not everybody, but there's a small percentage of Novus Ordo people that found the lockdowns insane. And I mean, you look at the percentage of growth of a lot of fraternity parishes, and it's 400%, 500%, very, very high. I think some of them over 1,000% increases because people were like, well, I don't want to go to Latin Mass, but I'm sick of, a glob of hand sanitizer in my mouth when I receive the Eucharist. So I'm done with this.
Yeah.
And made it.
Well, but it's not, we shouldn't ever, I know you know this, but it bears restating. It's not trad mass good, Nova Sorter mass bad. I mean, it's not a single on-off switch here. Like if you're on this side, you're good, and you're on this side, you're bad. It is an important factor. It can be a reflection. Most importantly, it's the best worship and due worship of Almighty God. But there are many other factors at play which strengthen Catholic piety.
Now, when I met you, we were both at a parish on the East Coast that served a lot of military families. I would guess it was over 50% military families at this Latin Mass parish that I was the number 3 priest at. I wasn't even pastor number 2. I was number 3 priest out there. Why do you think so many military families are led to the Latin Mass?
It's just cultural. I mean, it's straight up cultural. It's just there is so much congruence between a military culture and the culture surrounding the atmospheric surrounding the traditional mass, traditional priest formation. The respect, the reverence, as you put it, the order, the inward contemplation versus sort of the outward, expression. And that's why all those cultural reasons.
I think that's important. You mentioned the inner contemplation. I've been thinking back for a long time. That's the most important part of the Latin Mass. Why I like it the most, even if I were just a layman, not just a layman, if I were a layman instead of a priest, I think that's something we really pass over. We debate the Latin, we debate which way the priest is facing and stuff. But if you look at the history of the church, the interior life was the engine for the exterior life. Not just for priests, but even for lay people. And if the interior life is the engine of it all, then it has to be a mass that basically coordinates to the human soul. And that's what I love about the Latin Mass is I find that it is that which coordinates to the human soul the best if we're really called to be contemplatives in the world. Because from the contemplative life, at least from the inner life, and very few of us, not me, are reaching these, infused levels of contemplation. But even those very rare tastes of contemplation are more important than anything we do in the exterior life. So I don't think most people think of Navy people as contemplatives, but it's interesting that you mentioned that, because obviously strategy has to come before tactical decisions. The inner life has to come before the exterior in any good military decision, right?
Well, here's an interesting factoid: is that a personality survey of the officer corps had a full 40% of officers being highly introverted in the U.S. military.
Wow,
yeah,
that's amazing.
And that's just highly introverted. So at one end of the scale, we're not talking about the entire spectrum. So this correlation between introversion, it's an interesting thing to explore. However, we should be careful never to say, well, different strokes for different folks, different masses for different tastes, because that's not the measure of a mass. Yeah. Still, yeah. You asked the question about the cultural connection between the military, and that's how I would approach it.
And you and I would agree the Latin Mass is the best. And I think we'd also agree that you're going to have saints at the Novus Ordo and we're going to have some doofuses at the Latin Mass. I think that was your main point on that. Now, when I had you speak to the youth group out there, 5 or 6 years ago, I think there were some great questions from the kids, but then I asked you, what was the number one virtue that was identified in the men who made it through buds? And you had to think for a minute. Maybe you told me afterwards, because you were kind of going through the upstairs Rolodex for a while. And then I think you came up to me afterwards and you said, the guys who can take care of the task at hand. And I was really convicted at that because, we always have 1,000 things coming at us. I personally believe my virtue would be 200% higher if I could just wait till 8 p.m. to get back to all the texts. I don't even get back to emails. I'm sorry to my listeners. I don't even get back to emails. I have texts coming in all day. I really think my virtue would be a lot higher if I just waited to get back to all my texts at 8 p.m. I think you do that. I notice you get back to all my texts, but sometimes it's 24 hours later. What do you have to say about just growing in virtue with taking care of the task at hand? Is that still something 5 years later you'd suggest to people?
Yeah, I believe it even more, and I'm going to add a sort of corollary to that. Just for context, the father has mentioned BUDS training. BUDS training is the basic SEAL training pipeline. The attrition is about 80% in that particular course. These are young officers, young Navy officers, young Navy sailors who try out, and a number of studies have attempted to identify what makes somebody succeed and persevere through this difficult training. The only factor that they've been able to identify or come close to identifying is the ability to compartmentalize, your challenges. So if you are faced right now with a 4-mile, timed beach run, and you know that after that you're going over the obstacle course, and that's going to be an hour-and-a-half thrash, and then in the afternoon you're going to have to do that dreaded underwater swim, you're going to be overwhelmed. You're going to have trouble getting through the first event. But if you focus and compartmentalize on getting through just what I'm doing, I just have to do this 4-mile beach run in X number of minutes. And then whatever happens after that happens after that. It's going to happen or not happen. That seems to be the factor. And so you and I at the time talked about the idea of Saint Therese and her little way, and just do what is in front of you, right? Because people are full of anxiety and curiosity and anticipation of the future, fear of the future. But it's often said that, God reveals himself in facts. There's nothing more factual than what is in front of you right now in practical and objective terms to address. Everything else is the future. It's a phantom.
That's amazing. And I think, you and I were talking off the air that the traditional world is not immune to the suicidal thought. Everybody knows under this lockdown, suicide's taking more death than COVID. God rest the souls of those who died of COVID and suicide, of course. But statistically, the lockdown's leading to more suicides than even COVID deaths. And as you look around, clearly, even strong Catholics are not immune to these feelings. How do we live under lockdown? How do people, live at their homes? Obviously, drinking is way up, drug use is way up. And boy, I think if my listeners are going to walk away from this podcast just memorizing 2 words, I love mnemonics. So I've already put it into a mnemonic of CC, compartmentalize the challenge. So I know people finish podcasts. I usually can't even remember 2 days later the things I hear on a podcast. So if you want to memorize, listeners, a mnemonic, compartmentalize the challenge. I think that's just the best advice for facing life right now under lockdown, because you're right, Mike. I lay in bed and I'm like, okay, I got 4 hours of prayer as a hermit, a bunch of emails I'm not going to get back to, a bunch of letters. I have to make a video and a blog and respond to these texts. And there's probably going to be one phone call emergency. And I'm like, I can't do it. I can't do it. And then I just end up getting back to text for the next 2 hours, and maybe I'll get half of that done. But I love that advice. If you can compartmentalize the challenge. And by the way, I'm glad that Mike gave the basics of buds. I mean, that's kind of known in a facetious ways where they just try to drown you and see which guys don't get drowned, right? Pretty rough training.
It's highly controlled, but when you're going through it, it appears like you're constantly at that edge, that fetal position I described earlier. Yeah.
Wow. 80% attrition rate. And it's interesting. Everybody always says, well, it's the heart, it's the mind that gets you through it. But obviously you have to have some physical prowess to get through it.
It is, but it's the thing about the physical aspect of SEAL training is everybody gets broken down to the same level pretty fast. So any advantage you had going in, it's rapidly sort of leveled off, and then it becomes much more about your character, your will, your ability to work with teammates.
Okay. Character, that's it. How does Paul put it in Romans 5? He says, hope leads to endurance, endurance leads to character. And I've studied that word in the Greek, character. I really like the fact that you do that. And then Paul links endurance to character. This seems to be what we're really missing, that endurance. And, I think it's hard for modern man and modern women to enter into endurance, because you can just change careers in a heartbeat. You can change spouses in a heartbeat. You can change what you're going to do as far as like your parish ministry in a heartbeat. Endurance is really hard, I think, for the modern man, because we're encouraged not to finish things through. Anything that you can add to that on how we're called to just finish the project also?
Well, it's a good insight that you have, Father. It's endurance is lacking, and it's hard, and it's even harder when the world offers so many easy distractions, digital distractions and others, to persevere on something that's hard. It's a deep question. I know easy answers. There's a training of the will, I guess, that comes into it, which is important. In the sort of the sequence that you laid out about character and endurance, you have to almost start at the beginning. And our conversation last hour had to do with how, unfortunately, our modern, especially modern man is not receiving sort of formation at that most basic level.
Yeah, I gave up Facebook and Twitter for Lent, and you're smart. You're not even on those, but giving those up has really led me to see, wow, I'm just a lot more free in these things. And like I said, if I can just hold this resolution, I'm only going to get back to text at 8 p.m. Imagine how our day could be opened up. I was watching Jocko Willink, that SEAL, and his co-host talk about it. And one of his co-hosts was really, well, not really embarrassed. He was mildly embarrassed that he was sitting out in his car checking his cryptocurrency when he could have been in the gym working. And I thought, someone like St. Paul, if he heard that, he would apply that to the spiritual life. That, okay, instead of checking your Instagram or your TikTok or even getting back to texts, if that time could be in contemplative prayer or whatever else, okay, well, we're not all called to be monks, but everyone can make concrete resolutions. Like I said, maybe I'll just get back to all my texts at 8 p.m. So I think the task at hand can really be helped if we make concrete resolutions on our devices. Because I agree with you, Mike. It's our devices that's destroying our virtue, I believe. Very, very hard to stay virtuous.
Can anyone think of a text that they sent recently or had to get back to that actually had any that lasted more than 15 or 20 minutes in terms of its relevance? No, it has zero impact. It's easy come, easy go. It's just digits that fly off into nowhere. Yeah. It has no impact. It has just so little impact on anything.
No, every time I'm in an adoration chapel, someone has their phone on vibrate. They think vibrate isn't going to be heard by anybody because it's vibrate. And it's like, I still hear, and I don't say stuff anymore to people because it's just everybody has it on. So I just go to quiet churches in my hermitage to pray. But when I used to say something to people about this, you know what the answer every time was? Well, I'm waiting. There might be an emergency. Well, I mean, if there's an emergency, you shouldn't be in the adoration chapel. You should probably be in the hospital. But that line, I'm waiting, there might be an emergency. The vibrate is never an emergency. Just turn your phone off for 1 hour of adoration, right? So you're right. It's like we think it's super important stuff that's going to come through, but it's not. And these people didn't really mean it was an emergency. They just meant something mildly important might come through on their phone and they have to leave the adoration chapel for it. Guess what? Leaving the Son of God for a mildly important phone call is not worth it. Just keep it off when you go to adoration. That's how I see it. Not vibrate, off.
I totally agree.
The weirdest thing I ever saw someone doing in an adoration chapel, it was south of Denver, big adoration chapel. There was a guy cutting his fingernails in there when I was in there. He was this was just his personal hygiene time. And I said, could you take care of your personal hygiene at home? And a couple of ladies looked at me like that was rude to say, but whatever. That's what I asked them to do. So, Mike, on this topic of speaking out for reform of the church, tell us your thoughts on tactical versus strategic decisions. What I mean by that is, you mentioned earlier, like just having the courage in a restaurant to do the sign of the cross. There's a lot of priests who are afraid to speak up because they say, well, if I get suspended, then all you people lose the sacraments. And I think there's a lot of people in their jobs who say, well, if I do X, Y, or Z at my job, if I stand up for P, Q, or R, I'll lose it, and then my kids will be hungry. Okay, I get that prudence. I'm not going to say we should push against that and throw all caution to the wind and just be idiots. And so this is another one of those questions. I'm not giving you the best, but how do you draw the line between prudence in the workplace and courage? How do you draw the line in the priesthood between just prudence and recklessness, especially as we face these very, very humanly, never at the divine level of the church, but at the human level of the church, very unprecedented corruption? How do we speak up for the reform of the church while not becoming prideful or so reckless that we all lose our jobs and our faculties?
I probably, like you, I spend some amount of time reviewing what Catholics say on their on certain high profile blog sites and things, and a perennial question is, what is to be done? Or, what do we do now? So we've got the analysis right. We've got the truth. We've got the analysis right. We understand the situation. What do we do? And almost everybody falls back to kind of the same two or three conclusions. Personal piety. To make sure that you're growing in devotion and you're doing what you can control, your family or your flock. You and leave everything else sort of in the hands of God. And I think that I can't really improve on that advice, other than to say that every time God has saved his church, it is through the raising up of saintly leaders And I think that's what we should look for next, because we only have so much power as lay people. Uh, we can. But ultimately, it's got to be the raising up of a holy pope that will come. And until then, we do what is put in front of us, even if it means saying grace and crack a barrel. Surrounded by whoever. But let me try to be more specific about how much risk. Where does the balance between risk and prudence in public life? Tough question. No easy answer.
Yeah.
But I know that the answer is not to take no risk.
Mm-hmm.
You must.
Good.
There are certain cases when
I think
you
that's
must,
a great answer. Yep.
Speak out and say, that is wrong. That is disordered. That is wrong, immoral, sinful, against divine law. If you don't like it, you can't tell me I'm wrong on any logical or theological grounds. All you got to do is attack me ad hominem, and cancel me. If that's all you can do, I'm not afraid of that. I am not afraid of that.
That's great. And you're right. The Holy Ghost gift of counsel is going to be different for each person. The counsel is when you know what to do, think, say, act. And that's different. But I love how you say it. The notion that it's no risk applies to nobody. There's no way that everyone can come up with this excuse under the moral theology of consequentialism to eventually come to this point where they take no risks. So you're right. There's going to be a risk for everyone to save their soul. Speaking of saving soul, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say, I've made mistakes on the other end of the spectrum of wading into fights I didn't need to. But you know what? You know where that came from?
I can't believe it.
You know where that came from? That came from spiritual pride, from wanting to show everybody how smart and right I was. And you know what the result of that is? It's always bad. Right. So that gift of counsel that you describe it's such a discernment to understand when it's the time to speak up, but that time will come, and don't be afraid.
That's great. That time will come. And it's an overused phrase, of course, but pick your battles, obviously.
Yeah, that's it.
On this topic of salvation of souls, one of the things I'm really impressed with the SEALs for is, I think you maybe you told me this when we were on the East Coast together. I think you said something like, or maybe I heard this from another SEAL, so you can correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but a lot of these military agencies, they really do their best and they're happy if they finish. But if you guys aren't successful in a mission, it is a failure regardless of an A+ in effort. And I think right now there is a lot of talk, thankfully, in the Catholic world of saving your own soul and spiritual warfare. It's amazing. Even outside the Latin Mass world, everyone's talking about spiritual warfare. Everyone's interested in exorcisms. Everyone's interested in angels versus demons. And that's great. There's actually not a second part of my sentence saying that's a problem. That's actually really, really good. But there's still a sense that salvation's in the bag. My salvation's in the bag as long as I give the best effort. Now, without going in the direction of like Jansenism or rigorism, because you and I both love Saint Therese right here. And in some sense, she really does teach us if we do our best and we're baptized and living in grace, we're going to be saved. But one thing about the SEALs is you fight to win. You don't fight to do your best. How do we take that to heart in the salvation of our souls without being lazy and without being Jansenistic? I'm giving you questions with answers in the middle of it, so it's hard to answer. But
no, I can give you a perspective. I'll give you a little bit more color, and that's right. There's a big difference between how you feel about your performance and what the actual results of your performance are. That's the distinction you're trying to make.
That's exactly.
Sometimes it might be broken down into the idea of intentions versus outcomes. They can be different. Which should you be held accountable to? Your good intentions, the bad outcome, or vice versa.
Bingo.
But I'll tell you, you're absolutely right in that I've been on missions in which we execute perfectly and we failed the mission for any number of reasons. And I tell you what, the after action is brutal. We walk out of there, bloody in a figurative sense, but talking to ourselves about where we messed up, where we failed. Transferring this idea of results, outcomes and results, to the spiritual life, I think they're highly important. I think you will be held accountable to the results that you produced, either whether you intended them or they were unintended, but reasonably knowable. It is a difficult path, a dangerous path to go down, where, hey, as long as I try and I meant well, I'm not really responsible for what happens. You can see where that leads.
Bingo. Yep. Because, everybody knows the definition, not everybody, but any Catholic who studied at Franciscan University 101 knows a mortal sin has to be done with full knowledge, full consent of the will, and it has to be grave matter. And even though that is a classic definition of mortal sin, for most of the church's history, the emphasis was put on the third part, which is objective, grave matter, where nowadays there's places in the country that have forgotten about the grave matter, the objective, and it's only that you knew it was wrong. Okay, again, I'm not going to revamp the definition of mortal sin. Done with full knowledge, full consent of the will, and it's grave matter. But again, before 1900, the thing that everyone talked about in mortal sin on that was the grave matter, not the subjective side. So I'm just backing up what you're saying about there, that the outcome, the results, the after action plan primarily looks at the object, not the subjective approach to it with intentions. It might be a Protestant phrase, good intentions pave the way to hell. But I think it was actually Catholic before it was Protestant. And so not that we want to go down the road of Jansenism or God's looking for reasons for us not to be saved. But I think you're exactly right. We have to put the objective of the moral life, not the subjective feelings or even intention. We need to recenter on the objective act, the objective deed, the objective virtue or sin that we're doing as the primary thing that we're looking at once we've established that relationship with Christ.
In parallel, so this change in the way people approach grave matter versus intention and the execution of a mortal sin is kind of parallels how this social cultural shift from objective views, from objectivism, if that's a word, to this kind of emotional, more relativistic view of life, internal focused. So it's exactly parallel in culture. Which came first, the culture or the sort of the dogmatic approach to it? I don't know, but
I think it was Cardinal Manning. I always hear Michael Knowles quote. I think it was a Cardinal Manning. He says, "Culture is downstream of theology." So I do think that the world is going to follow where the Catholics go. Father Wolf, I think, who used to be in the fraternity, he is in the fraternity of St. Peter. He says, all graces and all errors flow from the altar. Well, that's a really interesting notion. We all know all graces flow from the altar, but if also all errors flow from the altar, what does that mean about our current world full of sterilization, contraception, abortion, masks, communism everywhere? It makes you start to wonder, wow, if we want to reform the world, it has to begin with us priests at the altar doing the right thing.
I think you're on solid ground there.